Picture a narrow strip of sand sitting alone in the Atlantic Ocean, with nothing but dark water on every side. Before we go any further into this story, if you want a brand new American mystery every single night, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. The year is 1590. The place is Roanoke Island, off the coast of what we now call North Carolina. The air smells like salt and pine, and something older than both. The trees grow thick and low along the shore, their roots tangled in black mud. The water around the island shifts between green and gray, depending on the light, and the light here changes fast. 1 hour it is gold and warm. The next it is the color of old pewter. A man named John White stands on a beach. He has just come ashore after 3 years away. 3 long years of war and weather, and waiting on the other side of the ocean. He came back to find the people he left behind. His people, 115 men, women, and children, who had built a small settlement in this strange new place and promised to wait for him. The settlement is empty, not burned, not destroyed, not torn apart by violence, just empty. The houses are gone. The fence posts still stand, but everything inside them has been cleared away, neat and deliberate, like someone packed up and left on purpose. The only thing remaining is a word. One word carved into the bark of a post at the entrance to the fort. Croatoan. No cross beside it. No sign of distress. Just that single word cut clean into the wood, standing there in the salt air like a quiet answer to a question nobody thought to ask the right way. White knew that word. It was the name of an island to the south. It was also the name of the people who lived there, a tribe who had been friendly to the English since the beginning. He believed in that moment that he understood. He believed the colonists had gone south to live with the Croatoan people. He wanted to sail down and find them. He never made it. A storm came up. His ships were damaged. His crew refused to push further. He turned around and sailed back to England, and he never returned to this coast again. He died without knowing what happened to his daughter, his son-in-law, or his granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. And for 400 years, has called this the mystery of the lost colony. But here is the thing about that word, lost. It is a word chosen by people who were not there. It is a word that assumes the colonists vanished, dissolved, ceased to exist in any meaningful way. It is a word that makes the story about absence, about nothing, about a blank space on a map where people used to be. The people who lived on this coast, the people who had been here for thousands of years before any English ship appeared on the horizon. They did not use that word. They did not describe what happened as a disappearance. They described it as something else entirely, something quieter, something that makes far more sense when you sit with it long enough. They said the English came, and then the English stayed, not as colonists, not as settlers planting a flag, but as neighbors, as family, as people who walked into the trees and became part of something that was already there. This island has a way of doing that. You can feel it even now if you stand on the right stretch of shore at the right time of evening. The light goes amber and low. The water goes still. The pines stop moving. And the whole place feels like it is holding its breath, like it knows something it has been waiting a very long time to say out loud. What happened to the Roanoke colonists is not a mystery because the answer is missing. It is a mystery because the answer was always there, living and breathing, and telling its own story in the villages along the Carolina coast, in the faces of people who remembered English words their grandparents taught them, in the soil of an island that held onto everything it was ever given. The colony was not lost. It was absorbed, and the evidence was buried, sometimes by accident, sometimes by design, and sometimes by the simple human habit of not listening to the people who already knew the answer. This is that story. To understand what happened on that island, you have to understand the world that sent people there. It is the late 1500s. England is a country that smells like coal smoke and river mud, and the particular kind of ambition that comes from watching other nations get rich. London is loud and crowded and alive with rumor. The streets are narrow. The buildings lean toward each other overhead like old men sharing a secret. Candlelight flickers behind oiled paper windows. shadows. The Thames runs dark and wide through the middle of it all, carrying ships in and out like the slow breath of something enormous. This is a world lit by fire, candles, torches, hearths. Shadows live everywhere. At night, a city street becomes a different place entirely. People move through the dark by memory and instinct, and the world beyond the city walls, beyond the known roads and mapped rivers, feels genuinely unknowable, not just far away, unknowable. Men wear wool and leather. Women wear layers so thick they can barely move through a doorway. Everything is heavy. Everything takes effort. The idea of crossing an ocean in a wooden ship, the size of a large house, eating salt meat and hard bread for weeks, sleeping in a hammock below a deck that smells of bilge water and tar. That was not an adventure. That was a gamble with your life. And yet people were willing to make that gamble because England was hungry. Spain had already found gold in the Americas. Portugal had already claimed its share of the New World. France was pushing into the north. England was watching all of this from across the water. And the men who ran England, the merchants, the nobles, the courtiers who whispered in the Queen's ear, they were not willing to be left out. Queen Elizabeth I sat on her throne in a gown stiff with embroidery and pearls, and she wanted what her rivals had. She wanted land. She wanted resources. She wanted a flag planted somewhere that wasn't already claimed. What she did not want was to pay for it herself. That is where men like Walter Raleigh came in. Raleigh was tall, polished, and ambitious in the way that only men with something to prove can be. He had the Queen's favor, which in that world was worth more than gold. He used that favor to get a charter, a piece of paper that said England gave him the right to claim land in the Americas in the name of the crown. He would fund it. He would organize it. And if it worked, he would profit from it. The plan sounded simple. It was not simple. Because what England wanted was a piece of something it had never seen and could not fully picture. The men drawing up these plans in their warm London offices, surrounded by maps that were half guesswork and half wishful thinking. They were imagining a place that did not exist. They imagined the Americas as a kind of empty stage, waiting for English people to walk onto it and begin the real story. They did not imagine the people already living there. Or if they did imagine them, they imagined them as minor characters. Background, scenery. That was the first mistake. It would not be the last. The land they were reaching for was the Carolina coast. A long, thin chain of barrier islands stretched along the edge of the continent like a string of pale beads. The water there is shallow and tricky. The inlets shift. The sandbars move. The wind comes off the Atlantic with a kind of authority that makes you understand immediately that you are not in charge here. The land is flat and low and green, covered in pine and scrub oak and marsh grass that turns gold in the autumn light. Herons stand in the shallows like gray statues. The air smells of salt and pine resin and something older, something that has no name in English. The people who lived there already knew all of this. They had known it for generations. They knew which channels were safe and which would swallow a boat whole. They knew where the fresh water was and where the fish ran thick in the spring. They knew the land the way you know a person you have loved for a long time. Every mood, every habit, every quiet warning sign. England did not know any of it. England just knew it wanted in. And so the ships were loaded, the sails were raised, and the long, slow, costly process of learning something the hard way began. The first men England sent were not settlers. They were scouts. They were soldiers. They were men who had been told to go look at something and come back with a report. And most of them were better at fighting than at listening. It was 1584 when the first two ships touched the Outer Banks. Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow led that expedition. Two young captains, both loyal to Walter Raleigh, both eager to prove something. They dropped anchor in the shallow water near Roanoke Island and stepped out onto the sand with the careful, stiff-legged walk of men who had been at sea too long. The air hit them first. That thick salt smell, the pine resin, the heat of a Carolina summer pressing down like a warm hand. Barlow wrote about it later. He called the land the most plentiful, sweet, fruitful, and wholesome of all the world. You can feel the relief in his words. The relief of a man who expected the worst and found something beautiful instead. He described the trees as tall and full. He described the grapes growing wild along the shore, so thick and heavy that the sea foam washed over them at the tide line. He was a man trying to make a place sound like paradise because his employer needed it to be paradise. Amata's was quieter, more watchful. He walked the perimeter of things. He counted. He measured. He was the kind of man who trusted numbers more than feelings, and the numbers he was gathering were not all good. The water was too shallow for large ships. The inlets were unpredictable. The sandbars shifted without warning. He knew what that meant for supply ships. He knew what it meant for escape routes. But he wrote it down carefully and said nothing alarming out loud. They met the Roanoke people within a few days. A man named came to them first, the brother of the chief Wingina. He came by canoe with 4 other men and sat at the far end of the English boat for a long time, just watching. Then he spoke. His voice was steady and low. He gestured toward the land. He made the kind of careful, deliberate movements of someone who has dealt with strangers before and knows that patience is the only tool that works. Granganimio had a broad, calm face. He wore copper around his neck. His hair was dark and pulled back, and he moved with the ease of a man completely at home in his own body, in his own land. He brought gifts: deer skins, coral. He accepted gifts in return with a kind of gracious dignity that Barlow noted with surprise, as if he had not expected dignity to exist this far from London. His wife came to the English camp a few days later. She walked right in. She looked at everything with open, direct curiosity. She organized the feeding of the English sailors herself, pointing and instructing her people with the quiet authority of someone who runs things and has always run things. She washed the Englishmen's clothes. She made sure they were fed. She was not performing hospitality. She was practicing it, the way you practice something you believe in. The English sailors watched all of this and wrote it down in the careful, slightly stunned language of men who had expected savagery and found civilization instead. 2 young Roanoke men agreed to sail back to England with Amadas and Barlow. Their names were Manteo and Wanchese. They were not the same kind of men. Manteo was open, curious, He watched England with the same direct attention his people had given the English ships. He learned fast. He asked questions with his eyes, even when he could not yet ask them with words. Wanchese was different. He watched England and understood something that Manteo was still deciding about. He saw the hunger underneath the manners. He saw the way English eyes moved over things, calculating value, calculating ownership. He came back to the Outer Banks a changed man, and not in the way the English had hoped. But that comes later. For now, picture them on the deck of that ship. Two young men from the Carolina coast, standing in the cold Atlantic wind, watching England appear on the horizon for the first time. The white cliffs rising out of the gray sea. The smell of a different world coming toward them. Whatever they felt in that moment, nobody wrote it down. Nobody thought to ask. The English were already moving on to the next thing, the next plan, the next ship to load and send west. The scouts came home. The reports were filed, and England decided it was ready. England decided it was ready. But Manteo knew something England did not. He knew the land they were sailing toward, not from maps, not from reports written by men who had spent a season on the coast and then gone home. He knew it the way you know your own kitchen in the dark, by feel, by smell, by the sound the wind makes when it comes off the water at a certain hour. His people were the Croatoan. They lived on the outer banks of what we now call North Carolina, on a long, thin strip of sand and pine and salt marsh that sat between the Atlantic Ocean and the quiet inland waters behind it. The land was not rich the way England thought of rich. There was no gold in the sand, no silver in the shallow bays, but it fed people. It had fed people for a very long time. Picture that place in the late summer. The light comes in low and golden off the water. The sea oats bend and sway along the dunes, pale yellow against a sky so blue it almost hurts to look at. The air smells of salt and warm pine, and something green underneath, something alive. Pelicans drift overhead in slow, patient lines. The sound of the surf is constant, like breathing. It never stops. After a while, you stop hearing it as noise and start hearing it as quiet. The Croatoan knew every part of that world, They knew which channels were safe to cross in a small boat, and which ones would pull you under without warning. They knew where the fish ran thick in the fall, and where the deer came down to drink at dusk. They knew the plants that healed and the ones that did not. They knew the weather by the color of the morning sky, by the way the birds moved, by the particular heaviness in the air before a storm came rolling in off the open ocean. This knowledge was not written anywhere. It lived in people. It passed from grandmother to grandchild, from hunter to young hunter, from healer to the one who would heal next. It was the kind of knowledge that takes generations to build and can be lost in a single bad season if the people who carry it are gone. Manteo carried it. He had grown up in it. And when he came back from England, he brought something new with him. He had seen how the English lived. He had seen their cities and their ships and their enormous ambition. He had learned enough of their language to speak it, and enough of their thinking to understand what they wanted. He stood between two worlds now, and he was smart enough to know that was a dangerous place to stand. But he was also, by all accounts, a man who believed that people could find a way. He had watched the English with curiosity rather than contempt. He thought there might be something worth building between his people and theirs. That belief would shape everything that followed. Back on the Outer Banks, life moved the way it always had. The Croatoan rose with the light. They fished the shallow sounds in long dugout canoes, moving through the morning mist with quiet paddles. They tended their gardens of corn and beans and squash, the plants growing in the dark sandy soil with a stubbornness that matched the people who planted them. Children ran along the water's edge. Fires burned low in the evenings. Stories were told. The villages were not large. A few dozen families, maybe more, living in houses made of bent saplings and woven mats, clustered near the water where the breeze kept the insects down. The houses were warm inside. The smell of wood smoke and dried fish and something herbal, something used for cooking or medicine, hung in the air. Dogs slept near the fires. The sound of voices carried softly through the dark. It was an ordinary life, a good life in many ways, a life built on deep knowledge of a specific place and on relationships between people who depended on each other to survive. Manteo understood that this life was fragile in ways his people had not yet fully seen. He had been to England. He knew what was coming, not the exact shape of it, but the weight of it. The hunger Wanchis had recognized in English eyes was real, and it was pointed west, and it was not going to stop. But the summer of 1587 had not yet arrived. The ships were still being loaded, and for a little while longer, the Outer Banks lay quiet under that golden light, the sea oats bending, the pelicans drifting, the surf breathing in and out like something ancient and unbothered. Then the ships came. It was the summer of 1587. 3 vessels. They crossed the Atlantic in the old way, the hard way, riding the trade winds south through the Caribbean before turning north along the coast. The crossing took weeks. The sea was not kind. It was never kind, but they made it, and when the low, dark line of the Outer Banks appeared on the horizon, the people on those ships felt something loosen in their chests. Land, finally land. There were about 115 of them. Men, women, and children. Families. This was new. The earlier attempts had been soldiers and scouts, men looking for gold or glory or both. This group was different. These were people who meant to stay. They brought seeds and tools and household goods. They brought the things you bring when you are not planning to come back. Their governor was a man named John White. He was a painter by trade, and a careful one. His watercolors of the people and plants and animals of this coast are still some of the most beautiful records we have of that world. He had been here before with the Grenville expedition. He had seen the land. He had drawn it. He believed in it the way some men believe in a place they have only half understood. The way a dream stays with you even after you wake. White was not a soldier. He was not a hard man. He was an observer, a recorder, a man who looked closely at things and tried to put them down on paper before they changed. That quality, that careful attention would matter later. It would matter more than he knew. The colonists landed on Roanoke Island in late July. The island was low and green, fringed with marsh grass and live oaks draped in Spanish moss that moved like gray curtains in the coastal wind. The air was thick and warm and smelled of salt and mud. bittersweetness of a place where fresh water and ocean water mix. Dragonflies hung over the reeds. Herons stood in the shallows like patient gray statues. The fort the earlier men had built was still there, mostly. The buildings were standing but overgrown. Vines had crept through the windows. Deer had been walking through the rooms. The place had the feeling of something that had been left in a hurry, which it had. White's people set to work clearing and repairing. They were practical. They had no choice but to be. But something was off from the start. One of the men, a colonist named George Howe, wandered away from the group to fish in the shallows. He was alone. He was not armed. They found him later with 16 arrows in him, face down in the water. It was a warning, or a response to something, or the result of a misunderstanding that had started long before these particular people arrived. Nobody knew exactly. Nobody wrote down what they thought it meant. They buried him and kept working. White reached out to Manteo. Manteo was still there, still moving between worlds, still serving as the thread that connected these two peoples who did not yet know how to talk to each other without someone bleeding. Manteo went to the Croatoan people on the island to the south, the people he came from, and came back with word that they were willing to meet, that they were not the ones who had killed Howe, that there might still be a way to make this work. There was a ceremony. The English baptized Manteo. They gave him a title, Lord of Roanoke and Daceman-Capuke, which was a strange thing to give a man who already belonged to a place in ways the English did not have words for. Manteo accepted it. He was good at accepting things from the English without letting those things change what he already knew. And then something happened that nobody planned for. Something small and enormous at the same time. A woman named Eleanor Dare, John White's own daughter, gave birth to a baby girl on the island. They named her Virginia. Virginia Dare. The first English child born in the Americas. She arrived on August 18th, 1587, in a rough wooden building on a low green island at the edge of a continent the English were only beginning to understand. White held his granddaughter. He looked at her small face. He must have felt something shift inside him. The way a door swings open onto a room you didn't know was there. somewhere nearby, in the trees just past the edge of the firelight, something moved. The Croatoan people knew about the baby before the English finished celebrating. Word travels fast when you live close to the land. A runner could cross the sound in a day. A fire on a hilltop could carry a message in minutes. The coastal people of that region had been talking to each other across water and forest for longer than anyone could count. They had their own roads, their own signals, their own ways of knowing things. The English thought they were alone on that island. They were never alone. Among the Croatoan, the birth of Virginia Dare was not a small thing. A child born on that ground was a child of that ground. That was how they understood it. The island did not care where your mother came from. The soil did not ask about your father's country. You came into the world in a place, and that place put its mark on you. Virginia Dare had arrived on Roanoke Island, and Roanoke Island had received her. In the old way of thinking, she belonged to it now. The elders talked. They always talked when something new arrived. There was a woman among the Croatoan, old enough that her hair had gone the color of winter grass, who remembered the first time English ships appeared on the horizon. She had been a girl then. She remembered the way the sails looked, white and enormous, like something that had no name yet. She had not been afraid. She had been curious. Curiosity was what you felt when the world showed you something it had never shown you before. She told the younger women about that first sighting. She told them about the men who came ashore and stared at everything with wide, hungry eyes. She told them how those men had taken notes in small books, writing things down in their scratching way, as if the world would disappear unless they captured it on paper. She found that strange. The world did not need to be written down to stay real. It was already real. It had always been real. The younger women listened. They had their own observations to add. They had watched the new settlers from the trees. They had seen the way the English women moved, careful and stiff in their heavy clothes, sweating in the Carolina heat. They had seen the men argue. They had heard the sharp sounds of English voices raised in disagreement. That hard, clipped language that sounded like someone breaking sticks. They had seen the baby. One young woman said the baby had cried she was born. She had heard it from across the water, that thin, high sound cutting through the night air. She said it sounded like any baby. She said that with a kind of quiet meaning, like any baby, not like a stranger's child, like a child. Manteo moved between these two worlds, the way water moves between stones. He carried things back and forth, without always saying what he was carrying. He knew what the Croatoan elders thought about the child. He knew what John White thought about the child. He held both understandings at the same time and did not try to make them into one thing. That was a skill the English did not have. They needed things to be one thing. There was a story the coastal people told about children born in unusual times. The story said that certain children arrived carrying a question inside them. Not an answer, a question. And the question was this: what are we going to do now? Not spoken out loud, just present, just alive in the child, the way a seed is alive inside a fruit. Virginia Dare, born on strange ground, born between two worlds that were still deciding what to do with each other, carried that question in her small body without knowing it. The English celebrated her birth with what little they had. There was prayer. There was probably some kind of drink, whatever they had managed to bring or brew. White wrote her name in his records with care. Virginia Dare. He gave her the name of the land itself, or the name the English had given the land, which was not the same thing, but felt like it meant something. Outside the rough walls of that settlement, the night was warm and loud with insects. The marsh grass moved in the dark. The water of the sound reflected the stars in long broken lines. Somewhere in the middle distance, a fire burned in a Croatoan village, and people sat around it talking in low voices about the child who had just arrived and what her arrival might mean and what it might ask of all of them before it was done. John White loved those people. That is the thing you have to hold on to as this story moves forward. He was not a soldier. He was not a merchant looking for profit. He was a painter, a careful man, someone who looked at the world and wanted to record it before it changed. He had been to this coast before. He had drawn the faces of the Croatoan people, the shape of their villages, the way their fires looked at night. He knew this place in a way that most English men never bothered to know it. And now he was its governor. And now he had a granddaughter sleeping in a rough wooden building on an island at the edge of everything. He had not wanted to be governor. That is worth knowing. The original plan had called for someone else to lead, but the men behind this venture, the men in London with their maps and their money, had pushed White into the role. He was trusted. He was known. He had been here before and come back alive, which was more than some could say. So he accepted it. He put on the weight of it, the way a man puts on a coat that doesn't quite fit. And he sailed west with 117 people who were counting on him to know what he was doing. The settlement at Roanoke was not his first choice of location. The plan had been to move inland, to find a place on the Chesapeake Bay where the land was richer and the politics were less tangled. But the captain of their ship, a man named Fernandez, refused to take them any further. Some say he had his own reasons. Some say he was tired and greedy and done with the whole business. Whatever the cause, the colonists were put ashore on Roanoke Island, the same island where the first English attempt had already gone badly, and told to make do. White knew this was not ideal. He had seen what happened to the men left here before. He had walked the same ground where that first group had struggled and failed. The soil of Roanoke Island was thin and sandy, pale as old bone in the summer sun. The trees were scrub pine and live oak, twisted by the coastal wind into shapes that looked almost like they were leaning away from something. The water around the island was shallow and difficult to navigate. Supply ships would struggle to reach them. They were boxed in on all sides by marsh and sound and open sea. Still, he tried to build something. He organized the settlement. He assigned duties. He worked to repair the damaged structures left behind by the previous group. He reached out to the Croatoan people who were willing to talk, willing to help, willing to share what they knew about this land and its seasons and its dangers. Manteo, the Croatoan man who had crossed the ocean twice and come back, changed both times, stood between these two groups and tried to hold them together with words. But trouble came fast. One of the colonists was killed while crabbing alone near the water. The 10 tensions with other nearby tribes, tribes that had never forgiven the English for earlier violence, were still raw and close to the surface. White tried diplomacy. He tried patience. He tried the careful, measured approach of a man who understood that this land was not his to command. Then the colonists asked him to do something that must have felt like swallowing glass. They asked him to go back to England. They needed supplies. They needed more people. They needed medicine and tools, and food that the island could not provide on its own. And they believed, rightly, that White was the one man who could make that case to the people in London, who controlled the money and the ships. He resisted. The records show it. He did not want to leave. He said it would look bad, like a governor abandoning his post. He said people would talk, but the colonists pressed him. They signed a document, a formal request, asking him to go. They put their names on it so that no one could say later he had run. And so he went. He stood on the deck of a ship and watched Roanoke Island grow small behind him. The water was green and flat that morning, the sky pale with early light. His daughter was there on that island. His granddaughter was there. Virginia Dare, 9 days old, was there. He told himself he would be back before the year was out. He told himself this was the right thing. The island disappeared into the haze, and the Atlantic opened up ahead of him, wide and cold and indifferent. He did not make it back before the year was out. The Atlantic had other plans. England had other plans. And the people on that island would wait through something that no formal record can fully capture. 3 years of silence, of seasons turning without a single ship on the horizon, of watching the water and seeing nothing come back. White arrived in England in November of 1587. The crossing had been rough. He was tired and thin, and carrying the weight of a man who had left people behind. He went straight to work. He met with Sir Walter Raleigh. He made his case. He talked about what the colony needed, what it had, what it lacked. Raleigh listened. The money men listened. And then the world got in the way. Spain was coming. King Philip II of Spain had been building something massive in the harbors of his country. A fleet so large that people who saw it said it looked like a city floating on the sea. Hundreds of ships, thousands of soldiers. The Spanish Armada was coming for England, and England knew it. Queen Elizabeth made a decision that would echo for centuries. She froze the ships. Every vessel in English waters that could fight was pressed into service. No ship could leave for the New World, not for supplies, not for colonists, not for anything. White was trapped on land while his family sat on an island 3,000 miles away. He tried. That part matters. He was not a man who gave up easily. He found 2 small ships, too small to be useful to the Navy, and he convinced their captains to make the crossing in 1588. They got as far as the open Atlantic before greed ruined everything. The captains decided to try a little privateering along the way, attacking Spanish ships for their cargo. The Spanish fought back. The English ships took damage. One of them lost so many supplies that the mission was pointless. They turned around and came home. White stood on English soil again with nothing to show for it. The Armada came that summer. England beat it back famously with a combination of fast ships and bad weather that the English would later call an act of God. The Spanish fleet scattered. The crisis passed, and White thought, surely now, he could go back. But the war had not really ended. It had just changed shape. English ships were still needed, still committed, still pointed at Spain. The money that might have funded a supply run was going to cannons and soldiers, and the slow grinding work of keeping a kingdom safe. Raleigh was distracted. The investors were cautious, and White waited. He wrote letters. He made requests. He knocked on doors that did not open. The months piled up like snow. 1588 became 1589. 1589 became 1590. 2 full years after he had left his daughter and granddaughter on that island, White was still in England, still waiting, still carrying the weight of a man who could not get home. Think about what that feels like. Not the dramatic version, the quiet version, waking up every morning knowing the people you love are somewhere you cannot reach. Writing their names in your mind before you sleep. Watching the weather and wondering what it means for them. Whether the winter was hard, whether the crops came in, whether the Croatoan people were still helping, or whether something had shifted in the long silence. White did not know. He could not know. The ocean kept its secrets. Finally, in 1590, a fleet of privateers agreed to take him along. They were going to the Caribbean to raid Spanish ships. They would stop at Roanoke on the way. It was not a rescue mission. It was a detour. White had no power over the schedule, no authority over the captains. He was a passenger, and a low-priority one at that. He took what he could get. The crossing took months. The privateers did their work in the Caribbean, slow and bloody and profitable. White waited on the ship while other men fought and counted their gold. He watched the sun move across the sky and counted the days. By the time they turned north toward the Carolina coast, it was August of 1590. 3 years had passed since he had watched Roanoke Island disappear into the morning haze. 3 years of war and weather and waiting. 3 years of silence from the people he had left behind. The coast of Carolina appeared on the horizon, low and green and still. White stood at the rail and looked at it. He had no idea what he was about to find. The ships dropped anchor on the evening of August 15th. The water was dark and calm. The Carolina coast sat low on the horizon, a thin green line between the sea and the sky. White could smell the land before he could see it clearly. Pine and salt, and something older underneath, like wet earth that had never been turned. They lit a fire on the deck that night, a signal fire. White stood near it and watched the shore. He was looking for an answering flame, some sign that the people on the island had seen them coming, some proof that life was still moving in that place. He saw nothing. The shore was dark. But then, later, someone on the ship spotted a light, a glow far off on the island. White's heart moved in his chest. He called out to the others. They saw it too. The captains ordered a small boat lowered into the water. White climbed down into it. They rowed toward the light through the dark. The light turned out to be a grass fire, old and slow burning. Nobody near it, nobody tending it, just fire doing what fire does when it has been left alone long enough. They rowed back to the ship in silence. The next morning, they tried again. They came ashore in daylight. The beach was quiet. sand was smooth. White walked up from the water and into the trees, and the sound of the sea fell away behind him. The forest was thick and green and full of bird noise. Everything looked the same as it had 3 years before, and nothing looked the same at all. They found the settlement, or what was left of it. The houses were gone, not burned, not broken. Gone. The wood had been taken down, or had fallen and been reclaimed by the ground. The palisade fence still stood in places, the posts dark with weather. Grass grew where floors had been. Vines had moved in over everything, slow and patient, the way vines do. White walked through it. He stepped over fallen timber. He pushed through the tall grass. He looked at the ground where his daughter had walked, where his granddaughter had been born, where people had cooked and argued and prayed and slept. All of it was quiet now. All of it was still. And then he saw the carving. On one of the palisade posts, someone had cut letters into the wood. Capital letters, clean and deliberate. Not the work of a frightened hand. Someone had taken time with this. Someone had wanted it to be read. The letters spelled Croatoan. White knew that word. He had agreed with the colonists before he left that if they moved, they would carve their destination into a tree or post. If they were in danger, they would add a cross above the word. He looked at the carving. There was no cross, just the word, just the name of the island to the south, the home of Manteo's people, the place where the Croatoan lived. He felt something loosen in him, not relief exactly, but something close to it. They had not been taken by violence. They had not scattered in panic. They had made a plan, and they had followed it. They had left a message. They had gone south. He went back to the captains. He told them what he had found. He asked them to sail south to Croatoan Island. It was not far. A day's sail, maybe less. The answer was right there, just over the water. The captains said no. A storm was coming. The anchors had already dragged once in the night. The ships needed water and supplies. The Caribbean had been profitable, and they wanted to go back. White had no authority. He had no leverage. He stood on the deck and watched the coast of Carolina slide past as the ships turned away. He never went back. He spent the rest of his life in Ireland. on a small piece of land, writing letters that nobody answered and accounts that nobody published. He wrote about what he had seen. He wrote about the word on the post. He wrote about his daughter and his granddaughter and the people he had left behind. He wrote that he hoped they were safe among the Croatoan. He wrote that he trusted God had kept them. He died without knowing. But here is what he left behind: a name carved into a post on a quiet island. One word that pointed south. One word that said, "We are not lost. We know where we are going. Come find us." Nobody came. That word did not appear by accident. Think about what it took to carve it. Someone had to find a knife or a chisel. Someone had to choose the post or choose the tree and press the blade into the wood with enough force to cut deep. Deep enough to last. Deep enough that 3 years of Carolina, whether salt air, summer heat, the slow rot that comes with coastal humidity, would not erase it. Whoever carved that word wanted it to be found. They were not panicking. They were not fleeing. They were leaving a message the way a careful person leaves a message. Deliberate, clear, pointing somewhere specific. Croatoan. That is the name of an island. It sits about 50 miles south of Roanoke, down the long chain of barrier islands that curl along the Carolina coast like a sleeping arm. Today that island is called Hatteras Island. In 1587, it was home to a people who called themselves the Croatoan. And those people had a relationship with the English that almost nobody talks about. Manteo was Croatoan. You heard his name earlier in this story. He was the man the English brought to London twice. He was the man who learned their language, crossed the ocean, and came back to his own land wearing a different kind of knowledge. When John White's colony arrived at Roanoke, Manteo was with them. He was their translator, their guide, the one person who could move between the two worlds without getting lost. And his people, his family, his home island, all of that was 50 miles south. So when the colonists carved Croatoan into that post, they were not writing a mystery. They were writing an address. They were saying, "We went to the people we knew. We went to the place where we had a friend. We went south to the island, to Manteo's people." That is not a disappearance. is a decision. And here is where the pattern starts to take shape. Because this was not the only sign. White himself had arranged a signal system before he left. If the colonists moved, they would carve the name of their destination. If they were in danger, they would carve a cross above the name. There was no cross above Croatoan. There was no cross anywhere on the post or the tree. The colonists had followed the plan exactly. They had done what they were supposed to do. They had told White where they went. He just never got there. But the word itself is only part of the pattern. The other part is what people started noticing in the years and decades that followed. Travelers who moved through the Carolina coast. Traders who worked with the native peoples of that region. Missionaries who came later in the 1700s, looking to convert and record. They kept finding the same things, over and over in different places, told by different people who had no reason to coordinate their stories. Gray eyes in the villages, lighter skin among certain families, children who looked different from their neighbors in ways that were hard to explain, and something stranger than appearance. English words, not borrowed words, not trade words, not the kind of language that spreads when two peoples do business. Old words, words that sounded like the English of the late 1500s, preserved in the mouths of people who had no contact with England. Words for tools and weather and family. Words that had been passed down the way all words get passed down, from parent to child in the firelight, without anyone writing them down. The same names kept appearing too. Dare, Harvey, Cooper. These were names from the colony's roster. Names that John White had written down. And generations later, those names were surfacing in communities along the Carolina coast, among people who had no official English ancestry, no record of European contact, no deed or document or church record to explain where those names came from. The pieces do not announce themselves. They do not line up in a neat row and ask to be noticed. They surface slowly, the way objects surface from deep water. A name here, a word there, a physical feature in a family portrait, a story told by an elder to a child who told it to their own child. Each one small, each one easy to dismiss on its own, but they keep rhyming, the same details in the same region across hundreds of years, told by people who never compared notes. That is not coincidence. That is a pattern. And patterns, when you follow them long enough, lead somewhere. This one leads south, 50 miles down the coast, to an island, to a people, to a word carved deep into wood by someone who wanted to be found. "50 miles south of Roanoke Island, the land changes. The coast gets quieter. The trees grow lower and wider, shaped by years of salt wind off the water. The light is different there, softer, more golden, like it's been filtered through something old. The island the English called Croatoan sat at the edge of the known world, the same way Roanoke had. But Croatoan was not a mystery to the people who lived on it. It was home. It had been home for a very long time. When John White came back in 1590 and found the word carved into that post, he was not confused. Not at first. He said so himself. He wrote it down. He believed the colonists had gone to Croatoan. He believed they were alive. He believed the carving was exactly what it looked like. A message left by people who knew where they were going and wanted someone to follow. That is the part of the story that gets forgotten. White did not find a mystery. He found a direction. He found an answer. The mystery came later, built slowly by people who were not there and did not want the answer to be that simple. Think about what it would have meant if the colonists had simply walked south and joined the Croatoan people. Think about what England would have had to admit, that the settlers had chosen a different life, that they had looked at the world the Croatoan people lived in and decided it was worth joining, that the grand English project, the dream of a new world built in the English image, had ended not with death, but with something far more complicated. A blending, a becoming, a quiet refusal to stay English. That was not a story England could use. England needed the colony to be lost. Lost meant tragic. Lost meant the wilderness had swallowed good Christian people whole. Lost meant the land was dangerous and savage and needed to be tamed. Lost meant England was the victim, not the empire that had dropped 100 people on a foreign shore with bad supplies and broken promises, and then left them there for 3 years. So the story became a mystery. mysteries, unlike answers, can be kept open forever. Here is what the record actually shows. White found the word Croatoan carved clearly, without the cross that would have signaled distress. He found the letters CRO carved on a separate tree, as if someone had started writing and then moved to a better surface. He found the fort dismantled in an orderly way, not burned, not broken down in panic. He found the heavy iron bars and cannon balls buried in the ground, too heavy to carry south on foot. So the colonists left them behind and covered them carefully. These are not the signs of people who were taken by force. These are the signs of people who packed what they could carry and walked away on purpose. White tried to sail to Croatoan. He wrote that he intended to go there. The weather stopped him. A storm pushed his ships off course, and the captain of the fleet refused to fight the wind. They turned back toward England. White never returned. And in that gap, in that space between the word on the post and the ships that never made it 50 miles south, the mystery was born. Not because there was no answer, because no one went to look for the answer. No one sailed to Croatoan and asked the people who lived there what had happened. No one knocked on that door. The English chose not to. That choice is the real mystery, not where the colonists went, not what happened to them in the dark and the cold and the years of waiting. The real mystery is why, for more than 400 years, the official story has been that nobody knows. When the colonists themselves left a note on a tree telling exactly where they were going. There is a particular kind of forgetting that is not accidental. It is the kind that serves a purpose, the kind that keeps a story useful. The lost colony was useful. It was a ghost story, a cautionary tale, a reason to send more ships and more soldiers and more settlers, a found colony, a colony that had walked into the trees and become something new, was not useful at all. So the word on the post was noted. It was written down, and then it was quietly set aside, like a letter you read once and choose not to answer. The Croatoan people were 50 miles away. They had been there the whole time, and nobody went to ask them what they knew. The Croatoan people lived on Hatteras Island. They had lived there for a very long time before any English ship ever broke the horizon. Their homes sat among the sea oats and the wind-bent pines. Their fires burned at night along a shore that smelled of salt and low tide, and the particular sweetness of marsh grass drying in summer heat. They knew every inlet, every sandbar, every place where the water turned shallow and green before it dropped away into deep blue. This was their world. They had not borrowed it from anyone. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. When John White sailed back to Roanoke in 1590 and found the fort empty, he was not afraid. He said so himself. He wrote it down in his own hand. He was not afraid because he saw the word. Croatoan, carved clean into the wood of a post, no cross above it, which was the signal the colonists had agreed on to mean distress. No sign of a fight, no blood on the ground, no bodies, just a name, a place name, the name of a people and the island where they lived. White knew that name. He had been there before. He had walked among the Croatoan people. He had eaten with them. He had watched Manteo, who was Croatoan himself, move between two worlds with the ease of a man who understood both. White knew exactly what that word meant and exactly where to go. He planned to sail south to Hatteras that same night. The weather stopped him. A storm came up fast, the way storms do on that coast, sudden and heavy, and full of wind that smells like iron. His anchor cable snapped. His ships were pushed out to sea. He tried to fight back toward shore and could not. He wrote that he hoped to return in the morning. He did not return in the morning. The ships kept moving. The captains were done with the Carolina coast and its shallow waters and its moods. They turned toward open ocean. They turned toward home. White never went back. He spent the rest of his life writing letters, asking for ships, asking for help, asking someone, anyone, to go south to Hatteras Island and look. No one went. He died in Ireland, an old man, still asking. Now hold that thought for a moment. Hold it the way you hold something fragile. The Croatoan people were not strangers. They were not an unknown tribe in an unmapped place. They were the people who had helped the colonists survive. They were the people who had warned the English when danger was coming. They were the people who had sent Manteo, one of their own across an ocean twice, so that the two worlds might understand each other. When the colonists carved that name into the post, they were not leaving a riddle. They were leaving a forwarding address. They were saying, "We went to the people who know how to live here. We went to the people who offered to take us in, and the Croatoan people had been there the whole time, 50 miles south, on an island shaped like a long green finger pointing into the sea, cooking their food, mending their nets, telling their stories, living their lives. They did not vanish. They did not become mysterious. They were simply there, the way they had always been there, steady and present and real. The impossible detail is not that the colonists disappeared. The impossible detail is that the people who almost certainly knew exactly what happened were right there, close enough to reach in a single day's sail. And the English looked at the ocean and turned around. 400 years of mystery, 400 years of theories and books and plays and television specials. 400 years of the word lost attached to those 115 people, like a stone tied around their necks. And the whole time, the Croatoan people were on Hatteras Island. Their descendants still are. They remember things. They have always remembered things. The stories passed from grandmother to grandchild, from elder to young person, sitting close to the fire on a cold night with the wind coming off the water. The English left a note. The note named a people. That people was never lost, never hidden, never gone. They were the answer written in plain sight on a post in a fort that the English built on land that was never really theirs to begin with. Some answers are ignored not because they are hard to find, but because finding them would change the story too much. So here is where the skeptics come in. They always come in. Every mystery has them. The people who sit back, fold their arms and say, "Slow down, not so fast." You are filling in gaps with wishful thinking. And honestly, you should listen to them. They are not wrong to ask hard questions. The first argument the skeptics make is a simple one. They say there is no direct proof, no document written by a colonist who survived, no letter from John White saying he found his daughter living among the Croatoan people, no English name recorded in a Croatoan village census, no grave marker, signed confession from history saying yes. This is what happened. Here is how it went. And they are right about that. There is no document like that. There never was. The second argument is about the silence. If 115 English people had walked into the trees and started new lives among the Croatoan, someone would have talked. A sailor, a trader, a Spanish spy, because the Spanish were watching everything the English did on that coast. Someone would have seen something and written it down. The skeptics say that silence is suspicious. That absence of evidence is, if not proof of nothing, at least a reason to be careful. That argument has weight too. You cannot ignore it. The third argument is about the word itself. Croat. The skeptics say it was a place name, not a people's name. That the colonists may have carved it to mean they were moving toward the island, not that they were joining the people who lived there. A direction, a destination, not a declaration of belonging. These are fair points, careful points, the kind of points that serious people make when they want to keep the question open and honest. But here is the gap. The skeptics can explain the silence. They can explain the missing documents. They can explain the carved word as a direction rather than a name. What they cannot explain is the agreement. The fact that John White himself, the governor, the man who knew those people better than anyone, did not panic when he saw the word. He said he would go to Croatoan Island and look. He was not confused. He was not baffled. He understood exactly what the message meant. A man who thought his family had been killed would not have said calmly, "Let us sail south and check the island." He said that because the message made sense to him, because he and the colonists had made a plan, and the plan involved the Croatoan people, and the word on the post was confirmation that the plan had been followed. The skeptics go a little quiet when you bring that up. They also go quiet about the timing. The colonists had been on that island for 3 years before White came back. 3 years is a long time to be cold and hungry and sick and afraid. 3 years is long enough to learn a language, long enough to trade, to borrow, to build something new out of 2 old things. The Croatoan people had already shown they were willing to help. Manteo was proof of that. He had crossed an ocean twice. He had been baptized in an English church. He had stood between two worlds and kept his balance. The relationship between these two groups of people was not the relationship of strangers. It was something older and more complicated than that. And then there is the land itself. Roanoke Island is small. It is surrounded by water. The forest is thick and dark green and full of sound. The marshes smell like salt and mud, and something older than either. In the fall, the light comes low and golden through the cypress trees and turns the water the color of amber. This is not a place where 100 people simply vanish. This is a place where 100 people had neighbors, had allies, had people who knew exactly where they were. The colonists did not evaporate. They did not dissolve into the air like morning fog burning off the sound. They were people. They had children and tools and names and fears and hopes. People like that do not disappear. They go somewhere. They become something. They fold themselves into a new life, the way you fold a letter before you put it away. The skeptics want a document. They want a signature. They want history to behave the way history almost never behaves. But the families that walked into those trees did not leave a document. They left something harder to ignore. They left descendants. And those descendants have been standing in plain sight for 400 years, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. Some of those descendants had gray eyes. That detail stops people. It stopped the explorers and traders who first pushed into the Carolina interior in the late 1600s and early 1700s. They were not expecting it. They came looking for trade routes and timber and furs. They came looking for land. What they found in the villages tucked back from the coast were people who did not look the way they expected. Gray eyes, sometimes blue, hair that caught the light differently, skin in shades that did not fit the neat categories these men carried in their heads. And something else, something that made the traders stop and pull out their journals and write it down, because they knew it mattered even if they could not yet say why. Some of these people spoke words that sounded like English, not full sentences, not conversations, but words, old words, words that had been carried in the mouth from parent to child, to grandchild, generations of living far from any English settlement. The words had changed shape a little, the way all words do when they travel, but the roots were there. The bones of the language were there. Men who had grown up in England heard those sounds and felt something shift in their chests. John Lawson was one of them. He was a naturalist and explorer who traveled through the Carolinas in 1701. He wrote about the Hatteras people, the ones who lived on the islands and the shores near where Roanoke had been. He noted that they had gray eyes. He noted that they claimed, with a calm and simple certainty, that several of their ancestors had been white people, not visitors, not strangers who had passed through. Ancestors, blood, family. Lawson wrote it down and moved on. He had other things to catalog, but he wrote it down. That matters, because Lawson was not a man looking for the lost colony. He was not trying to solve a mystery. He had no reason to invent this detail or dress it up. He was a careful observer, writing about what he saw and what he was told. And what he was told was that the people of these villages carried English blood in their veins and knew it, and did not find it strange at all. The people who told him this were not confused. They were not performing. They spoke with the ease of people describing something that had always been true. Something passed down so many times, it had become as ordinary as the color of the water or the shape of the dunes. This is who we are. This is where we come from. Some of our people came from across the great water long ago, and they stayed, and they became us. That kind of memory does not get invented. It gets carried. The believers, the people who have spent years studying this question, point to accounts like Lawson's and ask a simple thing. They ask you to consider the weight of it. A man with no motive to lie, traveling through a place no one was paying much attention to, writes down a detail that connects directly to a mystery everyone back in England had already given up on. He does not make the connection himself. He just records what he sees. The believers are not wild-eyed. They are not the kind of people who want the story to be more than it is. They are historians and archaeologists and members of the communities themselves. People who grew up hearing these stories from their grandparents and their grandparents' grandparents. They speak about it the way you speak about about something you have always known, quietly, without needing to convince anyone. What it cost some of them to speak up was real, to claim this history, to say that your people carry the blood of the Roanoke colonists, is to invite doubt. It is to invite people who were not there, and whose families were not there to tell you that you are wrong about your own origins. That is a particular kind of dismissal. It sits heavy, but they kept saying it anyway, because the gray eyes were real, because the words were real, because Lawson wrote it down, and he was not the only one, because the memory lived in the villages long before anyone thought to ask about it, long before the lost colony became a legend that outsiders wanted to own. The colonists folded themselves into a new life, and 400 years later, their descendants stood in the Carolina light, gray-eyed and calm, and told anyone who would listen exactly what had happened. Most people just were not listening yet. The land remembers things that people forget. That is not a poetic idea. It is something you can see and touch and measure if you know where to look. The ground around Hatteras Island has a particular quality to it. The soil is dark in places where it should be pale. The trees grow in patterns that don't follow the wind. Old-timers who worked that land for generations would tell you that certain spots feel different underfoot, softer, older, like the earth is holding something down. The Hatteras people knew this. They had always known it. The tribe that lived on that island and along those barrier shores had a relationship with the land that went back further than any written record. They knew which meadows flooded in which season. They knew where the deer would not go. They knew the places where the ground seemed to breathe at night, where the fog settled thicker than it should, where the roots of certain trees twisted in directions that made no sense given the way the light fell. And they knew which parts of that land had changed. There are places on Hatteras where old trees grow in near-perfect lines, not the wild, scattered way that trees grow when they are left alone. Lines, the kind of lines that suggest someone planted them, or that something once stood between them and shaped the way the saplings reached for sun. The forest grew up around a memory of structure. It grew up around the ghost of walls and fences, and cleared paths that no longer exist. The Hatteras people pointed to these places. They had names for them, not English names, their own names in their own language that translated roughly to things like the old ground or the place where the strangers settled. These were not new names. They were old names, passed from parent to child the way all important things are passed. Quietly, at the right moment, when the child was old enough to understand that some things are sacred and some things are simply true. The rivers around Hatteras have shifted over the centuries. That is not unusual. Rivers move. Coastlines change. The barrier islands themselves are not fixed. They migrate slowly, pushed by wind and tide and the long patience of the sea. But there are places where the old maps and the new maps don't match in ways that go beyond natural drift. Places where the water used to run that are now dry ground. Places where the ground used to be solid that are now marsh. The Hatteras elders described these changes. They described them as things that happened in the time of the mixing. That phrase appears in more than one account from more than one generation. The time of the mixing. It is not a phrase that came from European contact or from any missionary influence. It is older than that. It describes a specific period in the memory of the tribe when something changed, when new people came and stayed and became part of what was already there. Animals have their own memory. Hunters who worked the land around Hatteras for generations noticed that certain meadows were avoided by deer. Not all the time, not in every season, but in the early morning hours, in the deep quiet before the light fully arrived, the deer would skirt the edges of certain open spaces and not cross them. Old hunters said the ground in those places smelled different, like iron, like old wood, like something that had been buried and was still slowly returning to the soil. Nobody built a monument there. Nobody marked it on a map. The Hatteras people did not need a monument. The land was the monument. The trees that grew in lines were the monument. The meadows the deer avoided were the monument. The names they gave to certain stretches of ground were the monument. All of it was a kind of memory that did not require paper or ink or the approval of anyone outside the community. When researchers finally began to visit and listen in the 20th century, long after the legend of the lost colony had become a tourist attraction and a school lesson and a summer drama performed on an outdoor stage. The Hatteras people told them what they had always known. They described their ancestors. They described the mixing. They described the people who came from across the water and did not leave. They said it plainly, without drama. The way you describe something that has always been true. The land said the same thing in its own language. The lines of trees, the dark soil, the meadows the deer would not cross. The land does not perform for anyone. It simply holds what it holds. The Lumbee people live in Robeson County, North Carolina. They have lived there for a very long time, and for just as long, they have been telling a story that the outside world spent centuries ignoring. The story goes like this. Their ancestors, at some point in the deep past, met a group of English people, not as enemies, not as strangers passing through. They met them the way you meet someone who stays, the way you meet someone who becomes part of the family. The Lumbee say that English blood runs in their veins. They say English names came into their community and stayed there. They say the mixing happened long ago, in the quiet way that most true things happen, without ceremony, without record, without anyone outside the community writing it down. Historians spent a long time dismissing this. They called it a folk legend. They called it wishful thinking. They said the Lumbee were trying to claim a connection they had no right to claim. This is a familiar kind of response. It is the response of people who trust paper more than people. The Lumbee kept saying it anyway. There is something worth noticing here. The Lumbee are not the only native community in America that carries a story like this. Across this country, from the Atlantic coast to the deep interior, there are communities that hold memories of contact, of mixing, of two peoples becoming one. These stories were not written in books. They were carried in names, in faces, in the particular way a grandmother pronounced a word that nobody around her could explain. They were carried in bloodlines, and in the careful repetition of family history, passed from one generation to the next around fires that burned low and warm in the dark. The Lumbee surnames are one of the most striking pieces of this. When researchers began documenting the community in the 19th century, they found names that had no obvious origin in any native language. Names like Dial, names like Oxendine, names like Sampson and Barry and Locklear. Some of these names appear in the records of the Roanoke colony. Not all of them, but enough of them to make a careful person pause. The Lumbee did not need researchers to tell them this. They already knew. They had always known. The names were not a mystery to them. The names were evidence of something their grandparents had told them, and their grandparents before that, stretching back through time like a long thread pulled tight. This pattern shows up in other places too. In the Appalachian Mountains, there are communities of mixed ancestry that carry stories of contact so old that nobody can pin a date to them. In the swamps of South Carolina, there are families with features that don't match any single origin. In the hill country of Tennessee, there are bloodlines that historians have never fully explained. America is full of these quiet fusions, places where two worlds touched, and the touching left a permanent mark. The difference with the Lumbee is that their story lines up with a specific event, a specific group of people, a specific moment in time when 115 English men and women walked off a map and into a silence that the English world could not explain. The Lumbee have an explanation. They have had one for 300 years. What is remarkable is not just the story itself. What is remarkable is the persistence of it. Stories that are invented tend to fade. They get confused. They get contradicted. They lose their shape over time. But the Lumbee story has held its shape across centuries. The details are consistent. The names are consistent. The claim is consistent. That kind of consistency is not nothing. That is the shape of something true. There is also this. The Lumbee have faced enormous pressure over the centuries to give up their identity, to assimilate, to stop claiming what the outside world refused to recognize. They were denied federal recognition for most of American history. They were told in various ways and by various authorities that they were not who they said they were. And still they said it. Still they held the story. Still they passed the names down. That is not the behavior of people who invented something. That is the behavior of people who know something. The land around Robeson County is flat and wide and full of long light in the late afternoon. The rivers move slow and brown through stands of cypress and pine. It is quiet country, patient country, the kind of place that holds things for a long time without letting go. The Lumbee have been holding this story for just as long, and they are still holding it now. Some stories live in the mouths of people. Others live in the ground. The ground around Cape Creek on Hatteras Island has been holding its secrets for a long time. The soil there is dark and soft. It smells of salt and old wood and something older than both. For centuries, people walked over that ground without knowing what was underneath. Then, in the 1990s, archaeologists started to dig, and the dirt began to talk. The site at Cape Creek sits near the southern end of Hatteras Island, close to where the Croatoan people once built their villages. Researchers from East Carolina University came out here with tools and patience and a willingness to look at what the earth had kept. What they found was not dramatic at first. Pottery shards, animal bones, the usual quiet evidence of a people who had lived and eaten and worked in a place for a long time. But then the unusual things started to surface. Mixed in with the Croatoan artifacts were objects that had no business being there. European objects. Objects from the late 16th century. A piece of iron. A fragment of copper alloy. A small brass object that matched the kind of personal items English colonists would have carried. These things did not fall from the sky. They did not wash up on the beach from some passing ship. They were buried deep in a Croatoan village site. They were buried the way things get buried when people use them, lose them, trade them, or pass them down. Think about what that means. The Croatoan village at Cape Creek was not a trading post. It was not a port. It was a home. And inside that home, in the dirt beneath where families once cooked and slept and raised children, someone left behind pieces of the English world. The copper was especially interesting. The Croatoan people valued copper. They used it in ceremony and in trade. But the copper found at Cape Creek was not native copper. It was worked copper. European copper, kind that came across the ocean in the hands of colonists who brought it as a trade good or wore it as decoration or used it in ways that were ordinary to them and extraordinary to everyone else. That copper ended up in the ground at Cape Creek, and it stayed there for 400 years, waiting. There was also a piece of a slate writing tablet, small, worn, the kind of thing a child might have used to practice letters. The English colonists brought these with them. They were common objects in a literate household. They were not common objects in a Croatoan village, unless, of course, someone from a literate household had come to live in that village and brought their small, ordinary things along. The dig at Cape Creek was not a single season of work. Researchers came back. They kept digging. They kept finding things that fit the same pattern. European material culture buried inside a native village, layered in with the everyday objects of Croatoan life, not on the surface, not scattered randomly, mixed in, integrated, the way things get integrated when two groups of people start living the same life. Archaeologists are careful people. They do not like to say more than the evidence allows. But even careful people looking at what came out of Cape Creek had to acknowledge that something unusual had happened here. The official language was measured. The conclusions were cautious, but the objects themselves were not cautious at all. They were plain. They were physical. You could hold them in your hand and feel the weight of what they implied. There is a particular kind of proof that lives in objects. Words can be misremembered. Stories can shift. Documents can be lost or burned or locked away. But a piece of copper alloy buried 4 feet down in the soil of a 16th century village does not change its story. It does not forget. It does not get pressured into saying something different. It just sits there in the dark, patient as stone, until someone comes along with a brush and a careful hand and lets it speak. The ground at Cape Creek spoke. It said that English things had been here. It said they had been here long enough to get buried. It said they had been here in the middle of a Croatoan home, not beside it, not near it, but inside it, woven into the daily life of a people who, according to the official history, had nothing to do with the English colonists after John White sailed away. The dirt remembered what the history books forgot, and the dirt does not lie. But the dirt is not the only thing that remembers. People remember too. Families carry things forward across generations, the way rivers carry sediment, slowly, quietly, depositing a little here and a little there until something solid builds up on the bank. You might not notice it at first, but it is there. It has been there the whole time. There is a story that has circulated among certain families along the Carolina coast for a very long time. It is the kind of story that gets told at the end of a long meal, when the dishes have been pushed aside and the candles have burned low, and someone older than everyone else decides the moment is right. It is the kind of story that children half listen to, and then, years later, find themselves thinking about in the middle of the night. The story involves a ring, not a grand ring, not a royal ring, a simple band of gold, small enough to fit a woman's finger, engraved on the inside with a name and a date. The name was English. The date was in the 1500s. The ring passed through hands over the centuries, handed down through a family line that traced itself back to the Carolina coast, back to people who had lived among the Hatteras and the Croatoan long before any official settlement took root in that part of the world. Where did it come from? Nobody could say for certain. The family story was that it had always been there, that it had come from a woman who had come from somewhere else, that the woman had been absorbed into the community so completely that her name changed and her language changed, and her children grew up speaking a tongue she had learned late in life, with an accent that made the elders smile. But the ring stayed, because some things stay. This is how memory works in communities that do not write everything down. The object becomes the anchor. The ring sits in a wooden box, or gets wrapped in cloth, or gets worn on a cord around a neck, and the story travels with it. Each generation adds a little. Each generation smooths a little away. The sharp edges of the original event get worn down like river stones, but the core holds. The Kendall name appears in the records of the 1587 colony. There was a Master Kendall among the settlers. He was not a major figure. He left no great diary. He did not become famous. He was simply one of the people who crossed the ocean stepped onto that island and tried to build something in a place that was already full of life and history and meaning. And then he was gone, like the rest of them. Or was he? Because the ring with the English name and the date from the 1500s did not end up in a museum in London. It did not wash up on a beach. It did not get catalogued in some colonial inventory. It ended up in a family with roots in the Carolina coast, a family that told stories about a woman who had come from somewhere else and stayed. There are other objects like this. A buckle here, a piece of worked iron there, a small medallion of a type that English craftsmen made in the late 1500s, found not in an archaeological dig, but in a family home, passed down like an heirloom, because that is exactly what it was. These are not dramatic discoveries. They do not come with press releases or museum exhibitions. They come with quiet voices at the end of long meals. They come with old people looking at young people and saying, "You should know this." The thing about family stories is that they survive precisely because they matter to someone. Nobody keeps a story alive for 300 years unless it means something. Nobody polishes a ring and wraps it in cloth and tells their grandchildren about the woman who wore it unless that woman was real and her presence changed something. The official history had no room for these stories. The official history needed the colonists to be lost, vanished, gone without explanation. That was the story that served certain purposes, and it was the story that got written down and taught in schools and repeated until it felt like fact. But in the houses along the Carolina coast, in the families with long memories and older names, a different story was being kept. Not written, not published, just held, passed from hand to hand like a small gold ring that should not have been there and yet was. That should not have survived and yet did. Some things do not disappear just because the record says they should. There is a map in the British Museum. It is old. The ink has faded to the color of weak tea, and the edges of the paper have gone soft with age. It shows the Carolina coast as the English understood it in the late 1500s. Rivers, inlets, the long, thin barrier islands lines stretched out like fingers reaching into the sea. It is a careful map, drawn by a careful man, and for a long time, nobody paid much attention to a small square patch near the upper left corner. That patch changed everything. John White drew maps. He was a painter and a surveyor, and he documented the new world with the kind of attention that comes from someone who genuinely loved what he was looking at. His watercolors of the Carolina coast are still beautiful today. Birds with bright wings, fish with silver scales, native people standing in firelight. He saw this place, and he tried to hold it still on paper. One of his maps was copied and sent to England. It ended up in the hands of a man named Richard Hakluyt, who was something like a propagandist for English colonization. He believed in the project. He wanted it to succeed. And when the colony disappeared, that map went into a collection and stayed there for centuries. In 2012, researchers at the British Museum were studying White's maps with new technology, infrared light, the kind of examination that lets you see what is underneath the surface of old paper. And under that small square patch in the upper left corner, they found something. A second symbol, a fort, drawn in a different ink, in a slightly different hand, placed at a location inland from Roanoke. A location that matched the territory of the Croatoan people and their neighbors. Someone had drawn a fort, and then someone had covered it. The patch itself was made of paper. It was placed deliberately. It was not damage or repair. It was concealment. Someone had decided that whatever that symbol meant, it should not be seen. The researchers called this the patch map. They studied it carefully. They argued about what it meant. Some said the fort was a planned site, a place the colonists intended to go if things went wrong. Some said it marked where they actually went. Some said it was a mistake, a misread symbol, something innocent. The debate has not fully settled. It probably never will. But here is what you can hold on to. Someone covered that mark. Someone looked at that map and decided that a particular piece of information should not be visible. That is not an accident. That is a choice. People make choices like that when something matters, when information is dangerous, when the story being told in public cannot survive contact with the story written on the paper. England needed the colony to be a mystery. A mystery could be explained away. A mystery could be mourned and then set aside. A mystery did not raise uncomfortable questions about what the English had actually done out there on that island, or what agreements had been made, or what the real relationship was between the settlers and the people who had lived on that coast for generations beyond counting. A fort on a map placed inland in Croatoan territory would raise those questions. It would suggest that someone knew where the colonists went. It would suggest that the disappearance was not a disappearance at all, but a movement, a choice, a door that opened and then closed quietly behind people who had decided to walk through it. The patch covered the mark. The official story covered the patch, and the years covered the official story until it felt like bedrock. But bedrock is not the same as truth. It is just what has been standing longest. White's maps are still beautiful. The birds still have bright wings. The fish still catch the light. And somewhere in the upper left corner of one old document, under a square of paper that someone pressed down with careful hands, a small symbol sits in the dark. A fort, a location, a possibility that someone decided the world was not ready to see. Maybe they were right. Maybe the world of 1590 had no room for the truth that symbol suggested. A truth about people crossing lines that were not supposed to be crossed. About communities forming in the spaces between official histories. About human beings finding ways to survive that the powerful did not sanction and could not control. The patch is still there. You can look at the map yourself. The technology that found the symbol is not secret. The image has been published. The mark is visible now after 400 years of quiet. Some things do not stay covered forever. Some things do not stay covered forever. And tonight, standing here on this narrow strip of land between the Sound and the sea, you can feel that truth in the air itself. It is night on Roanoke Island. The water on both sides catches the starlight. The Sound to the west lies flat and dark, like a sheet of pewter cooling in the open air. The ocean to the east breathes slow and heavy. You can hear it from here. A long pull in, a long push out. The rhythm something much older than any country that ever claimed this shore. The trees are thick and close, live oaks with their twisted arms reaching low, wax myrtle and cedar pressing in from the edges. The air smells of salt and wet bark, and something green and alive underneath it all. Fireflies drift between the branches like slow sparks that forgot how to fall. The Spanish moss hangs still. There is no wind tonight. You stand here and you feel very small. That is not a bad feeling. It is an honest one. The stars above this island are bright, away from the cities, away from the lights. The sky opens up in a way that people in 1587 would have recognized. They saw this same sky. John White saw it. Eleanor Dare saw it. The Croatoan people had watched it for generations before any English ship ever broke the horizon. The stars do not care about official histories. They just keep burning. And here is the thing that the night makes clear, in a way that daylight and documents sometimes cannot. England needed the colony to be lost because the alternative was worse. Not worse for the colonists, for England. The alternative was that 115 English men, women, and children had looked at the world they were given and chosen something different. They had walked away from the flag. They had sat down at fires that were not English fires. They had learned words in a language that London had no interest in learning. They had married into families that England considered beneath notice. They had become, slowly and completely, part of something that the Empire could not own. That story had no place in the England of 1590. It had no place in the story a growing empire tells about itself. Empires need their people to stay people. They need clear lines between us and them, between civilized and wild, between the ones who belong to the story and the ones who exist outside it. When those lines blur, the whole project gets harder to explain. A colony that vanished was a tragedy, a mystery, something to mourn and then move past. It could be blamed on the Spanish, or the weather, or the wilderness itself. It kept the colonists as victims, helpless, English to the end, but a colony that chose to stay, that asked to be taken in, that gave up the name of England for the name of a people who had been here since long before any map was drawn. That was was a story about what people actually do when the ships stop coming and the promises run out. That was a story about which things matter when survival is the only question left. The night holds all of this quietly. The frogs sing in the marsh grass at the edge of the water. Something moves in the reeds, slow and unbothered. An owl calls once from deep in the tree line and then goes silent. The island breathes. 400 years have passed since a leaner dare walked this ground with her newborn daughter in her arms, since the men with shovels buried the chests and marked the trees and made their plans, since the last English voice on this island said something to the last English ear, and then the forest took them both. But the Hatteras people were here. The Lumbee were here. The families with the gray eyes and the old names and the stories about ancestors who came from across the water. They were here. They kept the memory in the way that people keep things when no one is writing it down. They carried it in their faces and their words, and the particular way they told certain stories to their children. The island does not feel haunted tonight. It feels full of all the lives that were lived here, in all the ways that lives get lived, across all the years that this narrow strip of land has sat between its two bodies of water. The stars burn on. The sound lies still. The ocean breathes. And somewhere in the dark, the truth just keeps being true, whether anyone is ready to hear it or not. There is a particular kind of knowledge that lives in women's hands, in the way a grandmother braids hair, in the way a mother hums while she works, in the recipes that never got written down because they didn't need to be. The women who carried this story forward didn't carry it in books. They carried it the way women have always carried the things that matter most, close to the body, quiet, steady, passed from mouth to ear in the ordinary moments of ordinary days. Think about a leaner dare for a moment. Not the symbol, not the name carved into stone. The woman. She crossed an ocean while she was pregnant. She gave birth on a strange shore with strange sounds all around her. She watched her father sail away. And then she made a life. Whatever that life looked like, wherever it took her, she made it. And the daughter she brought into the world on that August morning in 1587 grew up knowing something, knowing who she came from, knowing what her mother had crossed to get here. That knowing doesn't vanish, it moves. The Hatteras women told their children about the ancestors who came from the water. The Lumbee women kept names alive that had no business being in those Carolina woods. English names, old names, names that came from somewhere else and stayed. A woman in a village on the Lumbee River knew her grandmother's grandmother's name, and that name was English, and she said it the way you say something sacred. Not loud, just true. This is how the story survived. Not in archives, not in official records. In the mouths of women who understood that some things are too important to write down, because writing can be burned and paper can be taken, but a story told to a child in the dark before sleep is harder to destroy. The festivals came later. The pageant called the Lost Colony has run on Roanoke Island every summer since 1937. It is the longest-running outdoor drama in the country. Every summer, under the open sky, actors tell the story of the English settlers and their strange disappearance. The audience sits in the warm night air and watches a leaner dare hold her baby, watches John White sail away, watches the lights go dark on the empty village. The people of the Outer Banks have been watching this story told back to them for nearly 90 years. And something interesting happens when a community watches the same story that many times. The story becomes part of them. It becomes the way they understand their own place in the world. You are from here. This happened here. Whatever it means, it happened on this ground, and that ground is yours. The town of Manteo sits on Roanoke Island like it always has. Small and salt-worn and proud. The streets have the names you'd expect. The water is always close. The light in the late afternoon turns the sound into something that looks like hammered copper, and the marsh grass bends in the wind, and the pelicans move low over the water in that slow, deliberate way they have. It is a beautiful place, a place that knows it holds something. The people who grow up here grow up with a certain quality of attention. They look at the trees differently. They notice the old names on the maps. They hear the story of the colony, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a presence to be lived with. The mystery is not something that happened once and ended. It is something that is still happening, still unfolding, still asking questions that the land itself seems to be sitting with. And the native families of this region carry a different weight. For them, the story was never a mystery. It was just history. Their history. The story of what happened when two peoples met on this narrow strip of land and decided, together or separately, or some complicated combination of both, to become something new. That story belongs to them in a way it belongs to no one else. The women who told it kept it alive through every generation that tried to forget it. Through every official account that called the colonists lost. Through every history book that left the Croatoan people out of the ending, the women kept talking, kept humming, kept braiding the old names into the new days. That is the legacy, not the pageant, though the pageant is beautiful. Not the festivals or the historical markers or the museum on the island. The legacy is the unbroken thread of telling. The story passed hand to hand in the dark, across 300 years, by people who knew that some truths are too stubborn to disappear. Some stories travel. They don't stay where they were born. They climb into the pockets of the people who carry them, and they move across rivers and mountain passes and long flat plains until they end up somewhere nobody expected. There is a woman in this story. You won't find her name in any archive. She doesn't have a monument or a marker, but she exists in the way that all people exist who carried something important through a world that wasn't paying attention. She is the descendant of someone who walked off Roanoke Island and into the trees. And at some point, maybe a generation later, maybe two, she walked even further. Think about what that means, to be the child of a blending, to carry two worlds inside you and belong fully to neither one. The English part of you knows the smell of a hearth fire in a stone cottage, even if you've never seen a stone cottage. The Croatoan part of you knows the sound of the sound, the way the water moves at dusk. Even if you were born 100 miles inland, you are made of two memories, and you carry both of them into every new place you go. The Lumbee people of North Carolina have been saying for a very long time that they are part of this story, not a footnote, not a theory, living continuation. Their families moved west and south, away from the coast, away from the narrow barrier islands and the salt air, and the English ships that kept coming. They settled in the Lumber River region, in what is now Robeson County, and they built a life there. A whole life, a whole world. But they didn't leave the old story behind. They took it with them the way you take a scar. It becomes part of your body. You stop noticing it most days, but it's there. It shapes the way you move. The Lumbee have English surnames that predate any documented English settlement in their region. Names like Dial and Barry, and Oxendine and Locklear. Names that have no easy explanation unless you follow the thread back to the coast, back to the island, back to the 117 people who walked into the trees and became something new. Those names traveled. They traveled in the mouths of children who grew up and had children of their own. And those children moved further west, and the names kept going. A story in exile is a strange thing. It changes shape. It loses some details and gains others. The part about the island becomes vague, becomes a feeling more than a fact. The part about the English becomes a whisper, a rumor about grandmothers who spoke differently, who knew words from somewhere else. The specific place fades, but the feeling of it, the knowledge that you came from a meeting of two worlds, that part stays sharp. There is something almost tender about it. A people carrying the memory of their own becoming. Knowing that somewhere back in the chain of generations, two groups of humans looked at each other across a language barrier and a cultural divide and a whole ocean of difference, and decided to share a fire, to share a meal, to share children. That act of sharing is what the Lumbee carry, not the English have, not the Croatoan have, but the act of joining itself. When the Lumbee were formally recognized by the state of North Carolina in 1885, they were already living with this layered identity, already navigating a world that wanted them to be one thing or another. The recognition didn't resolve the complexity. It just named it officially. They were a people. They had always been a people. The paperwork just caught up. The story of Roanoke, told from the outside, is a mystery about disappearance, but told from the inside, from the Lumbee families who have been living with it for centuries. It is a story about survival, about the remarkable stubbornness of human beings who refuse to be erased. The colonists didn't disappear, they adapted. And the people who absorbed them, who taught them how to live in this land, they adapted too. Both groups changed. Both groups survived. And the descendants of that survival are still here, still living in North Carolina, still carrying names that don't quite fit any single explanation. That is what happens when a people become two peoples at once. You don't split in half. You don't lose yourself. You grow a second set of roots. And those roots go deep. Deep enough to hold through 300 years of forgetting. Deep enough to still be pulling water from the same old ground. And still the ground keeps giving things up. That is the part of this story that never quite closes. Every few years, something surfaces. A piece of pottery, a copper bead, a name in an old record that doesn't belong where it was found, an artifact in a museum drawer that nobody cataloged properly, sitting in a box for decades, waiting for someone to ask the right question. The dirt along the Carolina coast has a long memory, longer than any document, longer than any official account, written by men who were trying to explain something they didn't understand. The soil holds what the paper couldn't, and it keeps releasing what it holds slowly. The way a river releases a log after a flood. You don't know when it's coming. You just know it will. The dig at Cape Creek on Hatteras Island found English objects in layers of earth that had no business containing them. Objects that predated any known English settlement in that area. Copper that matched the kind the Roanoke colonists carried. A signet ring with a lion crest. The kind of ring a man of some standing would have worn. These things didn't walk themselves into the ground. Someone carried them. Someone traded them, or lost them, or buried them with intention. And that someone was living among the Croatoan people, eating their food, learning their words, watching their children grow up in a world that England had never imagined. Every time archaeologists go back to that site, they find something new. The dig is not finished. It may never be finished. The island is eroding. The sea is eating the edges of the land. And somewhere beneath the surface, there may be more. There may be a great deal more. The question is whether anyone will reach it before the water does. That urgency is part of what keeps this story alive. It isn't just history. It is a race. A slow, quiet race between the ocean and the shovel, between forgetting and remembering. And then there are the documents, the ones that keep turning up in archives, in estate collections, in the back rooms of libraries, where old papers sit in boxes tied with string. Researchers have found references to the Roanoke colonists in records that were never meant to be read as clues. A mention here, a name there, a note in the margin of a report about native trade routes that references English-speaking people living inland, far from any coast, far from any place the English had officially settled. These notes were not written as evidence. They were written as observations, small details that someone thought were worth recording. But they add up. They form a shape, and the shape looks less and less like a mystery, and more like a story that was always there, just told in a language that the official record refused to learn. The Lumbee people have been pointing at this shape for a long time. They have been saying quietly and then louder that the answer was never hidden. It was just ignored. The evidence was not buried in the sense of being concealed. It was buried in the sense that nobody wanted to dig. Nobody wanted to find what was actually there, because what was actually there complicated the story that England needed to tell about itself. A colony that failed is a tragedy. A colony that succeeded by becoming something else entirely, by dissolving into the people it was supposed to conquer. That is something harder to celebrate. That is something that asks uncomfortable questions about who owns a land and who belongs to it, and what it means to survive by letting go of who you thought you were. Those questions don't have clean answers. They never did. And that is why people keep coming back to Roanoke. Not because it is unsolved, but because the solving of it keeps revealing new layers of something larger. Something about what America actually is. About how it was made. About the quiet, unrecorded moments when two groups of human beings looked at each other across a fire and decided, without ceremony, without paperwork, without anyone writing it down, to keep each other alive. The evidence keeps surfacing. A ring, a shard, a name. river stone worn smooth by handling. Each piece is small. Each piece is partial. But they keep coming. They keep rising up through the soil and the years and the long silence that was never really silence at all. The door is open. It has always been open. You just have to be willing to walk through it without knowing what you'll find on the other side. And so here we are. The fire has burned low. The coals are orange and quiet. The night has settled in around you like a heavy blanket, soft and dark and still. You've been sitting with this story for a long time now, and the story has been sitting with you. Think about what we actually know. In 1587, 115 English men and women and children walked onto a narrow island off the coast of what would become North Carolina. They built small houses. They planted gardens. A baby girl named Virginia Dare took her first breath on that sandy ground. And then the governor sailed away to get supplies, and the world closed in, and 3 years passed like a slow tide. When John White came back, they were gone. Every last one of them. The English called it a mystery. They wrote it down that way. They passed that word forward through the centuries until it became the official version of events. The lost colony, the vanished people, the great American riddle with no answer. But the Croatoan people were there. The Hatteras people were there. The Lumbee were there. They had been there the whole time, living on those islands and along those rivers and through those pine forests that smelled of salt and resin and old rain. And they remembered. They kept remembering, even when no one came to ask them what they knew. The colonists were not lost. They walked south. They walked into the trees. They sat down beside fires that were already burning, and they were fed and sheltered. And over time, they became part of something that had existed long before England ever looked at a map and decided it wanted a piece of this continent. That is not a mystery. That is a human story, one of the oldest kinds there is. Two groups of people, strangers to each other, finding a way to share a world. No ceremony, no treaty written on fine paper, no king's signature at the bottom of anything, just people cold and hungry and afraid, accepting warmth from hands that were offered freely. The evidence has been surfacing for years, English crest found in the soil of Cape Creek, shards of English pottery buried among the remnants of Croatoan villages, family names that echo across centuries, gray eyes in faces that had no English blood according to any official record, stories told by grandmothers to grandchildren, passed down the way all true things are passed down, quietly, in private, in the language of people who know that the official version left them out. None of this is tidy. None of it wraps up clean. History rarely does, especially the history of places where two worlds pressed up against each other and had to find a way to breathe the same air. But here is what feels true when you sit with it long enough. The colonists survived because they were willing to let go. They let go of England. They let go of the idea that their way was the only way. They let go of the names and the customs and the borders they had carried across the Atlantic like stones in their pockets. And when they let go, they floated. They found ground. They found people who would keep them alive. That is a kind of courage that never made it into the history books. It is quieter than conquest. It leaves fewer monuments. But it is real, and it happened. And the descendants of those people are still here, still living on this land, still carrying something in their blood that connects them to a small wooden settlement on a narrow island in the late summer of 1587. Roanoke was never a disappearance. It was a beginning, a strange, unplanned, unrecorded beginning to something that America has been working out ever since. What it means to belong somewhere, what it means to become someone new, what it means to survive by opening your hands instead of closing them into fists. The island is still there. Roanoke Island, off the coast of North Carolina, low and green and quiet. The water moves around it the same way it always has, silver in the moonlight, dark and deep beyond the shallows. The trees stand close together along the shore. The wind moves through them at night with a sound like breathing. Nothing is lost there. It never was. It is just living by different rules now. Older rules, the kind that were never written down, because the people who kept them knew that some things are safer in the telling than on the page. Subscribe for a brand new mystery every night. One tap, and a new story is waiting for you tomorrow. Sleep well.